Since Donald Trump took office on January 20th, he's launched an all-out assault on the federal government, working to dismantle parts of it agency by agency and bulldozing through norms. No surprise here, though, because this is exactly what he promised he would do. It was all written down in a 900-page book that I carried around and read to you weekly for months. And written into that book, I'd say between the lines, but you didn't really have to look between the lines to find it, was a sentiment that went far beyond consolidating power in the presidency. It was about re-entrenching hierarchy, from Christian nationalism to the patriarchy to white supremacy. Within days of taking office, he signed an order gutting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across our federal institutions and pressuring private industry to follow suit. Within hours of the worst airplane crash in more than 20 years, he blamed diversity without citing any evidence whatsoever for a crash that killed 67 people. Meanwhile, the so-called tech industrial complex is working hard to roll back existing regulations and prevent new ones at the expense of American consumers, your safety, your privacy, and your rights. This trajectory, where unregulated capitalism and racial retrenchment go hand in hand, is nothing new in American history. My next guest, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones, argues that this reality traces back to the nation's very founding. American power and capital were built on black exploitation. And any attempt to dismiss the link between American capitalism and race, deriding it as identity politics, for example, only allows structural white supremacy to persist. Note that I'm saying structural. This isn't to suggest that most or even many Americans are racist, but that we live in a society whose economic strength was built on and perpetuated by a system of racialized economics. And that system didn't end with the abolition of slavery. That's because the same forces that uphold racial hierarchies also protect and concentrate wealth in just a few hands. And these are the same forces that have helped usher in today's oligarchy. The historian Nathan D.B. Connolly has long criticized efforts to downplay the role of race in Trump's rise to power. In 2018, reflecting on his 2016 victory, Dr. Connolly wrote, quote, "Even before Election Day wrapped up one of the most racist political campaigns in recent memory, white observers on the left, center, and right began telling us that what we had just witnessed was not about race. We were supposed to understand the hurting heartland. They warned the far left to be careful with the white supremacy label and suggested that those who pursued wrong-headed identity politics owed middle America an apology," end quote. To understand Trump's ascent, Connolly says we must first understand how capitalism and white supremacy in America have historically reinforced one another. Trump's inauguration speech, where he promised a complete restoration of America, echoes the defeated Confederate cry that the South will rise again. In the decades following Reconstruction, the country experienced the Great Nadir, a period of racial retrenchment and violent enforcement of white power. According to Connolly, as once conquered Confederates snatched black people's legal protections, the courts and Congress elevated corporations to their current status as rights-bearing citizens. In their efforts to secure even modest concessions from capital, white workers abandoned and turned on black comrades, splintering interracial labor movements. W.E.B. Du Bois captured the era's brutality, writing, "God wept and still is weeping, for there began to rise in America in 1896 a new capitalism and a new enslavement of labor," end quote. With Trump's ascent, Connolly argues that we are witnessing a second nadir triggered by recent civil rights gains. Today, just as then, white capital firmly holds the levers of politics and media. In the decades leading up to Trump, America shifted from explicit racial violence to institutionalized inequality, all cloaked in the rhetoric of colorblindness. Following the civil rights era, overt racism was replaced with coded rhetoric that allowed white supremacy to persist under new guises. Officials, for example, masked racism by calling for law and order and the need to protect property rights. They condemned the so-called welfare ethic. Race was pushed to the background, Hannah-Jones argues, obscured by slogans about the economy, small government, and so-called traditional values. This societal shift was buoyed by Supreme Court decisions that not only dismantled federal protections for black people under the guise of neutrality, but also erased the violent history that triggered those protections in the first place. A key example is the court's 1978 decision in Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, which barred academia from considering past discrimination when evaluating applicants, effectively severing any connection between current inequality and its historical roots. According to Connolly, this shift effectively undermined the civil rights movement's hard-won gains, enabling white supremacy to persist through more subtle institutional mechanisms. And then came Trump. He called our collective bluff, bringing to the forefront the racism at the core of many of these policies. As Connolly observed, quote, he repeatedly broke the discursive norms that had been greasing the wheels of American capitalism since the passage of the Civil Rights Act because Indiana-born Judge Gonzalo Curiel was a Mexican. Trump deemed him unqualified to adjudicate the Trump University fraud case. Because NBC debate moderator Lester Holt was black, Trump decided he was a Democrat and thus part of the phony system propping up Hillary Clinton, end quote. Lester Holt, by the way, was a Republican. Trump, in other words, refused to play by the old playbook with its thinly veiled attempts at racial tolerance, and he won. Trump's victory can be traced to decades of efforts to discredit and dismiss America's racist history, but confronting these historical forces and their enduring impact will be crucial for resisting them today in Trump's America. That will require restoring a broader institutional awareness of our nation's racist legacy, writes Connolly. Quote, the president-elect safely mocked disability, African Americans, and Latinos, performing his best in those areas where Americans enjoyed none of the intellectual and cultural infrastructure required to reject his brand of politics. On race specifically, our institutional priorities continue to undermine the formation of a racially literate public. You cannot topple racial injustice, sexism, or class exploitation without race, gender, or class thinking early, often, and in public. And that requires, in place of mere diversity, a restoration of historical thinking. But great to see you, Nicole. Thank you for being with us. Nicole is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter from the New York Times Magazine. She's a creator of the 1619 Project. She's the founder of the Center for Journalism and Democracy at Howard University. She's the co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society. Nicole, let's talk about this idea. I was talking about it with Eddie Glaude yesterday, that as we see progress, particularly for black people or people of color or marginalized groups in America, this happens. We get remarkable pushback. And some people think that in 1865, the Civil War ended and slavery ended and things marched happily on. Not true at all. It was fully 100 years later that we even got close to the equality that most people think we got in 1865. And now we're in this sort of a period again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I think what's important to understand in this moment, I called it the second nadir. That phrase, the nadir, was coined by the historian Rayford Logan. And it talked about this period that we now call Jim Crow. So why is that important? Because right after slavery, we have this remarkable period called Reconstruction, and Black Americans just coming out of slavery achieve remarkable rights. This is where we get the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which guarantees Black men the right to vote and says you can't deny people the right to vote based on race. We also get the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which is one of the most, to this day, expansive civil rights laws ever passed in America. It bans housing discrimination and other types of discrimination. And then we have Jim Crow. So we have to ask ourselves, I think sometimes it is not within the imagination of Americans that you can gain rights and then lose those rights completely. But that is exactly what happened. So if we look at the 100 years later that you're talking about, the period of the civil rights movement, which of course was a deadly period where Black Americans were literally being killed trying to fight for basic rights. They had earned those rights a century earlier and had to wage a battle against their country to regain those rights under the civil rights movement. I fear we're in another one of those periods where we see this kind of initially a slow pace of the pulling back of rights that Black Americans and therefore all Americans have earned. And then we see this moment where all three branches of government align. And then you can see a massive withdrawal of those rights. And so we have to be very careful we can decide in this moment as Americans, are we going to enter another nadir, or are we going to push back against that and continue to pursue an egalitarian society? But this is an inflection point. And I fear, because we don't understand that history, we don't know that you can gain rights in the United States and you can lose those rights almost completely.
As we also saw with abortion rights. You've long argued, people tell me the election was all about economics. And as an economics guy, I remind people apparently all elections all around the world are always about economics. But you have made the argument that Trump's rise was not simply about economic anxiety, but that racial retrenchment, it does play a role in this. So what do you say to people who insist that race is always secondary to Donald Trump's economic populism and the price of eggs?
I would say look at how he has spent the first few weeks of being reinaugurated as president. So yes, what we're often calling economic anxiety is actually demographic anxiety. And we can see how many executive orders did Trump sign into office that were targeted at helping everyday Americans pay their bills, at lowering costs, at lowering prescription drug costs, at lowering grocery costs. You didn't see any. But what you did see was attacks on what they're calling diversity, equity, and inclusion. You saw the rolling back of Executive Order 11246, which outlawed discrimination in hiring in the federal government and its contractors. You saw a purging of anything having to do with diversity. You saw mandates that they cannot actually acknowledge the Juneteenth or Black History Month. So he has come out of the gate with a racial agenda, not an economic agenda. So I think all we have to do is look at what he's done. And there's an understanding that you can actually divide people from each other who have a common economic concern by dividing them and wedging them by race. And that's what we've seen. So if people really want to say this election was about economics, look at your price of eggs. Look at the fact that prescription drug prices are not getting cheaper. Look at what he has done since he came into office. And we see that it has been a racial agenda. It has not been an economic one.